April 15th, 1945. Dachau, Bavaria, Germany. In that corridor, no one was screaming. There were no gunshots, no shouted orders, no frantic running. Only the distant echo of British boots advancing somewhere in the abandoned building, and the occasional creak of a door opening, one after another. The camp had been taken just a few hours earlier. For some, the war was already over. For others, fear hadn't gotten the message yet. The air was heavy with military disinfectant mixed with something older, deeper, something no chemical could erase. The corridor walls, stained with damp, seemed to sweat. The wooden floor groaned under the weight of soldiers moving room by room, opening doors and counting bodies, living and dead. Outside, the mid-morning sun lit a landscape torn straight from a nightmare. Empty barracks, piles of abandoned clothing, and a thick silence draped over everything like a wet blanket. Elisa Rosenfeld was sitting on the floor of the last room at the end of the hall, her back against the icy wall, knees pulled tight to her chest. She wasn't crying. That stage was long past. There was no panic on her face, only a deep, ancient exhaustion accumulated over years. She was 24, but decades lived inside her eyes. Her hands, thin and scarred, rested motionless on her knees. She wore what had once been a blue dress, now reduced to a shapeless gray rag, stripped of dignity. Her hair, cut short and uneven, framed a face that had forgotten how to smile. When the door opened, hallway light burst in and cast a long shadow across the floor. A British soldier appeared in the doorway, tall, uniform coated in dust, helmet sitting crooked. Thomas Caldwell didn't raise his weapon or shout. He simply looked. His hazel eyes swept the empty room and stopped on the small, folded figure against the wall. That morning he had already seen many prisoners. Broken men unable to hold a gaze, silent women who trembled at the sound of footsteps, children who reacted to nothing at all, their eyes fixed on some invisible point. But there was something different about her. Maybe the way she met his eyes without blinking. Maybe the fact that she didn't ask for help, didn't reach out, didn't move at all. She sat there as if she had decided this was the place where everything would end. Thomas took a step forward. His boots echoed in the empty space. "It's all right now," he said in English, his voice low, almost unsure. Even to him, the words sounded wrong. What could "it's all right" possibly mean in a place like this? Elisa took a few seconds before responding. Her lips barely moved, as if she were testing the words before letting them go. When she finally spoke, she didn't ask for water. She didn't ask if she was free. She asked nothing at all. She only said in German, with a clarity that cut the air like a knife, "I was born in Nazi Germany." The sentence landed heavy and lifeless. It wasn't a plea or an accusation. It was a statement, a kind of life sentence delivered with the calm of someone who no longer expects absolution. Thomas understood enough. Not the exact words, his German was basic, learned during the occupation, but the tone, the way she said it. This wasn't an introduction. It was a confession. A summary of everything she had lived through and everything that had been done to her. It was as if she were saying, "I am the enemy. I am the one everyone hates. I am the one born on the wrong side of history." For a moment, the soldier hesitated. He glanced down the corridor, where others were still moving forward, opening doors, calling out numbers. Then he looked back at her. Elisa hadn't moved an inch. She sat there with her knees to her chest, waiting for the inevitable. Then, without another word, Thomas Caldwell stepped back, left the room, and closed the door. The latch turned with a soft, metallic click. And in that simple, silent gesture, something changed. Because this was not a door being closed to imprison, but a door being closed to protect. And Elisa knew it the instant the sound of the latch echoed through the silence. In that moment, for the first time in many years, someone had chosen to stand on her side of fear. Someone had decided to see her not as the paperwork described her, but as what she was in that instant. A person sitting on the floor, a person who had simply told the truth. Outside in the corridor, 60,000 prisoners waited to be counted, classified, registered. Inside the barracks, thousands were still dying of typhus, dysentery, and starvation. In makeshift offices, British officers filled out forms, assigned numbers, and decided fates as if order could be imposed on chaos. Inside that room, a woman had just said out loud something no one else dared to admit. And a soldier had just made a decision that defied all military logic, a decision that would end up saving far more than a single life. If this story moved you, you can support it by liking the video and subscribing so you don't miss the next ones. If you'd like to help a bit more, you can also become a member or use the corresponding button. Thank you. Every gesture helps these stories travel farther. And tell me in the comments which city and country you're watching from. I want to know from where you're standing with those history tried to silence. When British troops arrived at Dachau on April 15, 1945, they did not find a labor camp, but a cemetery operating in broad daylight. More than 10,000 unburied bodies lay piled between the barracks, and around 60,000 people were still technically alive, though many were too weak to survive even another week. Typhus was spreading unchecked. Dysentery was killing dozens every hour. The SS had fled days earlier, leaving behind chaos, death, and proof of something for which Europe still had no words. Captain Derek Sington, one of the first British officers to enter the camp, wrote in his diary that same night that no human language existed to describe what they had seen. The dead lived alongside the living. The living looked dead, and those who came to liberate them had no idea where to begin. The British Army was not prepared for this. They had trained for combat, for strategy, for taking cities, not for managing a humanitarian hell on this scale. There were not enough doctors, not enough proper medicine, not enough food that could be digested by stomachs that had gone months, even years, without real nutrition. Some of the first soldiers to enter the barracks vomited at what they saw. Others stood frozen, staring at something their minds refused to process. In the first 3 days alone, more than 500 additional people died. Not from direct violence, but because their bodies could no longer absorb help that had arrived too late. Some prisoners ate full rations and died hours later from refeeding shock. Others simply faded away, as if the arrival of freedom had been the signal their bodies were waiting for to finally let go. The war was over in technical terms. Hitler would take his own life within 2 weeks, and Berlin would fall in a matter of days. But Dachau was still killing, and in the middle of that administrative nightmare, there was one group of prisoners no one knew how to classify: German Jews. Born in Germany, native speakers of the language, raised on Goethe, Beethoven, and German schools, people without valid passports from any other country, without families waiting elsewhere, without an embassy to claim them. Germany had marked them with yellow stars, deported them in cattle cars, tortured them in concentration camps, and now the Allies didn't know what to do with them because legally they were still German, and Germany was the enemy. The Poles had Poland, the French had France, the Dutch had the Netherlands. German Jews had only a piece of paper that said German Reich, and a country that had tried to erase them from existence. They were not refugees from an occupied land, but citizens of the occupying country. And that distinction, absurd and cruel at the same time, left them trapped in a legal limbo with no clear way out. Some officers suggested keeping them in separate camps until their status could be resolved. Others proposed sending them to the Soviet-controlled zone, where, according to military logic, they would be returned to the very Germany that had hunted them. There were even those who argued that they should be investigated as possible collaborators, because by that twisted logic, how could they have survived as Germans in German camps? For Elisa Rosenfeld, this wasn't a theoretical paradox or an administrative dilemma. It was her entire life, the sum of everything she had been, everything that had been taken from her, and everything she would never be able to recover. Elisa was born in 1921 in Augsburg, into a family of Jewish merchants who were fully assimilated. Her father, Jakob Rosenfeld, owned a shop selling imported fabrics in the city center. He dealt in Italian silks, Egyptian cottons, and English wool, and was known in the neighborhood for his honesty and his sharp business sense. Her mother, Anna, gave piano lessons at home, in a living room that smelled of furniture polish and aging sheet music. She had 9 regular students, all children of well-to-do families nearby. They were German. They felt German. They spoke German at home, read Goethe and Schiller, listened to Wagner on the gramophone, and celebrated Christmas alongside Hanukkah. Because, as Jakob liked to say, they were Jews, yes, but also Germans. And that didn't have to be a contradiction. When Elisa was 7, her teacher praised her in front of the entire class for having one of the most beautiful handwritings she had ever seen. She told her that one day she could be a writer, a secretary, anything she wanted, and that Germany needed smart girls like her. It was 1928, and the world still seemed to make sense. In 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power, Elisa was 12. The first thing that changed was her teacher's gaze. She stopped praising her. She stopped calling her to the front of the class. When Elisa raised her hand, she was ignored. Her assignments began receiving lower grades, with no explanation. In March of that same year, the teacher simply told her she could no longer attend that school. Elisa's father didn't lose the shop overnight. It happened through a slow, calculated process designed to look legal. First, some customers stopped coming. Then municipal inspectors appeared and suddenly found problems with permits. Then Italian and Egyptian suppliers stopped answering letters. Finally, in 1935, a new law forbade Jews from owning businesses that served non-Jewish customers. Jakob was forced to sell the shop for a fraction of its value to an Aryan buyer appointed by the government. Anna stopped giving piano lessons, not by choice, but because families stopped sending their children. One mother even told her, almost kindly, that it wasn't personal, but her husband felt it was inappropriate for their son to spend time in a Jewish home. Elisa was transferred to a Jewish school that opened and closed, depending on the mood of local authorities. Sometimes it stayed open for 3 months straight. Other times it shut down without warning for a week. The teachers were volunteers, many of them elderly professors expelled from universities. They taught from old books, with no new materials, in cold classrooms where coal for heating was often in short supply. In 1938, during Kristallnacht, the Rosenfeld home was ransacked. Elisa was 17. That night, she heard glass shattering, shouting, and boots climbing the stairs. Uniformed men burst in, smashed furniture, destroyed her mother's piano, and took everything of value. When her father tried to protest, they beat him until he lay unconscious on the living room floor. Jakob was arrested the next morning and sent to Dachau. Elisa and her mother heard nothing from him for 3 weeks. When he finally returned, he had lost nearly 70 pounds, had 2 broken ribs, and refused to talk about what he had seen. He only repeated, again and again, that they had to leave, that they had to get out of Germany. In 1939, the Rosenfeld family tried to emigrate, but by then, it was already too late. The borders were closed or collapsing. U.S. consulates were buried under waiting lists that stretched for years. South American countries demanded sums of money the family no longer had, and ships bound for Shanghai or Cuba were fully booked months before departure. Jakob sold everything that remained, jewelry, furniture, books, to try to buy forged papers through a contact who promised documents for Switzerland. He handed over the money. The contact vanished, and the money with him. In 1940, the Rosenfelds were forcibly relocated to a communal building on the outskirts of Augsburg, where dozens of Jewish families lived crammed together, waiting for orders that always arrived too late or too early. In 1941, those orders finally came. Deportation to the east, destination the Riga ghetto in Latvia. The journey lasted 5 days inside a windowless freight car, with no toilets and no water. 120 people crushed into a space meant for 40. When they arrived in Riga, the cold was so intense that Elisa couldn't feel her toes. Her father, already weakened by months of malnutrition, developed pneumonia during the first week and died in December 1941 in an unheated barrack, coughing up blood while she held his hand. He was 52. Her mother lasted longer. Anna Rosenfeld was stronger than she looked. She cleaned latrines, hauled rubble, did any task that kept her on the list of those deemed useful. But in March 1942, during one of the so-called clearing operations, she was selected, along with 300 other prisoners, and taken to the Rumbula forest. Elisa never saw her again. Years later, she learned that her mother had been shot into a mass grave alongside thousands of other Jews from the ghetto. Elisa was 20 when she was left completely alone, and at that point, something inside her shut down. Not hope, which she had already lost, but fear. She stopped being afraid because she no longer had anything to lose. No family, no future, no memories untouched by blood. Only the present, day after day, surviving by sheer biological inertia. She endured 2 more years in Riga, working in a munitions factory where chemical dust burned her lungs, eating scraps other prisoners threw away, sleeping on lice-infested bunks. When the Red Army began advancing from the east in 1944, the Germans evacuated the camp. She was transferred to Stutthof in Poland, then to Ravensbrück near Berlin, and finally, in March 1945, when the German rail system was already collapsing under Allied bombing, sent to Dachau on one of the last transports. She arrived sick and malnourished, with an infection in her left foot that wouldn't heal and caused intermittent fevers. But she was still alive. And in Dachau, that bordered on a statistical miracle. When the British arrived on April 15th, Elisa was in a barrack full of dying women. Some no longer moved at all. Others babbled in languages no one could understand. She could barely walk. Every step sent pain shooting through her infected foot. She had a fever, but her mind remained clear, and that terrified her more than anything else, because her thoughts kept circling the same brutal truth. She had nowhere to go. Germany had ceased to be her country, and she had no other. And then, in that silent corridor, Thomas Caldwell appeared. He was 22 years old. Born in Liverpool in 1923, he had grown up in a narrow house near the docks, where his father worked loading ships and his mother sewed in a textile factory. Thomas had left school at 14 to help at the port, earning a few pounds a week and handing every bit of it over at home. He was an ordinary young man, not especially brilliant, not particularly brave. He didn't read much, drank now and then, and on Sundays played football with friends from the neighborhood. When the war began in 1939, Thomas was 16. He watched Liverpool being bombed night after night during the Blitz. He saw buildings collapse, bodies pulled from the rubble, and his own cousin killed, crushed by a wall that came down during an air raid. When he turned 18 in 1941, he enlisted in the British Army without enthusiasm, but with a quiet conviction that it was the right thing to do. Someone had to stop Hitler, and if that someone had to be him, then so be it. He was sent first to North Africa, then to Italy, and later to France after the landings. He saw combat in Normandy. He saw men die in ways he hadn't known existed. He saw friends blown apart by landmines and cities reduced to dust. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared him for what he found at Dachau. It was his first concentration camp, and what he saw there broke him in a way no battle ever had. He had witnessed death in combat and the destruction of war, but never death that was organized, systematic, industrial. Never bodies stacked like firewood. Never people so thin they looked like skeletons wrapped in skin. Never children with empty eyes, staring without seeing. The first night in Dachau he couldn't sleep, not because of noise. The camp was eerily silent after the SS fled, but because of the images that returned every time he closed his eyes. The piles of corpses, the faces of the prisoners, the way they looked at him as if he were the world's last hope. That terrified him, because he knew he wasn't. He was just a boy from Liverpool trained to fire a rifle, not to save souls. For the first 2 days, his assignment was to open doors and count prisoners. A mechanical task, meant to keep the soldiers busy while doctors organized aid. Open a door. Count how many people were inside. Write the number down. Move on to the next room. There was no time to talk. No space for empathy. 60,000 people had to be catalogued before they died of typhus or starvation. But when he opened the door to the room where Elisa was, something stopped him. He never knew what it was. Maybe the way she looked at him, without fear and without desperate hope, only with a weary recognition, as if she already knew how everything would end. Or maybe it was the fact that, unlike other prisoners who surged toward the door, she didn't move. She didn't stand up. She didn't reach out. She just stayed seated against the wall, knees pulled to her chest, waiting. Thomas said the only thing that came to mind, "It's all right now." And Elisa, after a silence that seemed endless, answered in German, in a voice so clear it was impossible to imagine it coming from such a fragile body. "I was born in Nazi Germany." Thomas didn't speak German fluently, but he knew enough from the occupation, not only to understand the words, but to feel their weight. She wasn't introducing herself. She was confessing an original sin no one would ever forgive, having been born German in a country that had become synonymous with horror. She was saying, without saying it, "I am the enemy. I am one of them. I am someone everyone has the right to hate." And then Thomas Caldwell made a decision that appeared in no manual, a decision that could have cost him his career and defied the logic of the entire system. He stepped back, left the room, closed the door from the outside, turned the latch, and stood guard. He didn't shout out a prisoner count. He didn't write Elisa's name on any list. He didn't mark the room as cleared or occupied. He simply stayed there, standing with his back against the door, smoking a cigarette while his hands trembled just slightly. A sergeant passed down the corridor and asked what was in that room. Thomas crushed the cigarette against the wall. "Empty, Sergeant. Awaiting sanitary inspection." The sergeant nodded and moved on. And with that simple lie, delivered without hesitation, Thomas Caldwell became something he had never planned to be: a protector. For the next 3 weeks, Dachau was controlled chaos. The British set up field hospitals and military tents, burned entire barracks to slow the spread of typhus, and brought in medical units from England, Scotland, and Ireland. Nurses, doctors, and pharmacists arrived, along with trucks of medicine, special food for the severely malnourished, and clean blankets. Though even then, it was never enough. People kept dying, and the problem of classification remained. Prisoners were separated by nationality: Poles in one sector, French in another, then Dutch, Belgians, Russians, Czechs, each group with its own area, its own lists, its provisional records. Red Cross representatives appeared with forms. United Nations officers conducted interviews and began organizing repatriation transports. But German Jews didn't fit anywhere. They weren't Allied nationals, and on paper they were still citizens of the Reich, even though that same Reich had tried to exterminate them. That left them in a legal limbo, without clear rights or defined protection, with no one responsible for them. Some officers suggested keeping them in separate camps until their legal status could be resolved. Others proposed sending them to Soviet-controlled zones, where, by bureaucratic logic, they would be returned to Germany. There were even those who argued they should be investigated individually. After all, how could they have survived as Germans in German camps? Didn't that imply some form of collaboration? Elisa knew it. All the German Jews in Dachau knew it. They had heard the rumors, seen the separations, felt the suspicious looks. They had survived the Nazis, but now they risked not surviving the peace. Thomas Caldwell wasn't an officer. He had no authority to change policy or issue orders, but he had something more practical: a door he could close, a uniform no one questioned, and an ability to lie he hadn't known he possessed. For 3 weeks he kept Elisa in that room, not as a prisoner, but as someone under his protection. He brought her food from British rations: biscuits, canned meat, chocolate when he could get it. He brought clean water in canteens filled at the purification station. He brought military blankets and clean bandages for her infected foot. And above all, he never registered her. He never put her name on any list. In the camp records, the room was listed as empty, pending sanitary inspection due to possible typhus contamination. No one questioned it. There were too many rooms, too many barracks, too many prisoners. A room marked as contaminated slipped by unnoticed, just another marginal note in the larger chaos. Elisa didn't understand why Thomas was doing all this. At first, she thought it was simple compassion. Later, when he kept coming back day after day, she wondered if maybe he expected something in return. But time passed, and he appeared only twice a day, morning and night. He left food. He left water. He asked if she needed anything. Then he left. He didn't try to touch her. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't ask personal questions. They spoke very little. She was still weak, and speaking cost energy she didn't have. His German was basic at best. But between them, a silence settled in, one that didn't need words, the shared silence of people who had seen too much. Thomas had seen the horror of Dachau. Elisa had lived inside that horror for years, And in that closed room, for a brief moment, neither of them had to explain anything. Elisa's foot began to heal. The fever slowly broke. Her weight crept up, not enough to call it recovery, but enough that she could sit without feeling dizzy. Her voice stopped breaking, and little by little she began to ask questions. One night, in slow, careful German, she asked him why he was doing all this. Thomas, sitting on the floor on the other side of the room, took a long time to answer. In the end, he said in English, knowing she wouldn't fully understand it. Because it's not right. What happened isn't right. Elisa understood. Not right. She nodded and then, in a voice steadier than she had had in years, she said thank you. Thomas didn't reply. He just nodded and left. But that conversation marked a change. From then on, when Thomas came, he stayed a little longer. He told her small, almost insignificant things. Liverpool, his family, football. Elisa didn't understand everything, but she listened. And sometimes, very occasionally, she spoke too. She told him about Augsburg, about her mother, about the piano, mixing the few English words she knew with German. Thomas understood enough. It wasn't friendship. Not exactly. It was something stranger. A connection born between two people thrown into the same hell from opposite ends of the world, now bound by a secret that could destroy them both. Until the day of the general inspection. On May 5, 1945, 3 weeks after liberation, a special United Nations commission arrived at Dachau to assess the humanitarian situation and begin the formal process of repatriation. They came with lists, forms, and clear orders. Every prisoner was to be registered, photographed, interviewed, classified, and prepared for transfer. There would be no exceptions, no rooms left unchecked, no incomplete lists. Thomas learned about it that morning at his platoon briefing. The captain was explicit. Every room would be inspected, every prisoner counted, and any irregularity investigated. When Thomas entered Elisa's room that day, she was already awake. She looked at him without speaking. He didn't speak either at first. He sat down across from her, his back against the opposite wall, and for the first time in 3 weeks, he asked a direct question. "What are you going to do?" Elisa took a moment before answering. When she did, her voice was calmer than he had expected. "I don't know. I have nowhere to go." Thomas nodded, because he knew it was true. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his uniform and pulled out a folded document. A British Army form, official-looking. A temporary identification for locally contracted auxiliary personnel. Blank. No name. No date. He had stolen it from his captain's office 2 days earlier, when no one was looking. "If you sign this," he said in slow English, searching for the words, "you can say you worked for us as a translator. We register you as support staff, not as a prisoner." Elisa looked at him, not fully understanding. Thomas went on, using his hands to help. "It's not permanent, but it gives you time, until you know what to do, until things calm down." It was illegal. It was military document forgery. It could mean a court-martial and years in prison. They both knew it. Elisa took the paper with slightly trembling hands and read it slowly, struggling through the English. Auxiliary personnel identification. Interpreter. Locally contracted. She looked up at him with an expression Thomas couldn't decipher. It wasn't gratitude. Not exactly. It was something deeper. The look of someone who had just realized that for the first time in years, another person was willing to risk something for her and expect nothing in return. "Why?" Elisa asked in German, almost in a whisper. Thomas didn't answer right away. He stared at the floor, his hands clasped over his knees. Then, without lifting his eyes, he answered in English. Words Elisa barely managed to understand, but which sounded more honest than any official speech she had ever heard. Because no one should have to pay for the place they were born. Elisa pressed the paper to her chest, closed her eyes, and for the first time in 4 years, felt something she had forgotten existed. Hope. Not the grand hope of justice or a clear future, but something smaller and more concrete. The possibility of deciding what to do the next day. That same afternoon, Thomas filled out the document. He wrote, Elisa Rosenfeld, born 1921, Augsburg, Germany. Function, German-English interpreter. Contracted, May 5, 1945. He forged the captain's signature with a shaky but believable hand and stamped the paper with a seal he had borrowed from the administrative office. The next day, when the United Nations Commission arrived to inspect the camp, Elisa was no longer in that room. She was in the auxiliary personnel sector, wearing civilian clothes Thomas had obtained for her, too large but clean, holding the forged document and a simple story. She had worked as a translator for the British Army during the first weeks after liberation. No one asked questions. There was too much chaos, too many conflicting lists and missing forms for one more name to matter. Elisa Rosenfeld was officially registered as locally contracted auxiliary personnel, not as a prisoner, not as German, not as Jewish, but as a worker. With that lie sealed and signed, Thomas Caldwell gave her something the system never would have: the ability to choose. The months that followed were strange. Elisa was assigned to the camp's translation department. Her job was to translate orders from English into German, identify documents soldiers had found, and act as an interpreter when communicating with prisoners who didn't speak English. It wasn't difficult work, and most of the time she sat in an improvised office waiting for someone to need her. Thomas secured her a place in the auxiliary barracks, a shared room with 3 Polish women who also worked for the British. Regular food rations, clean clothing, and most importantly, a name on a list that didn't say German Jewish prisoner, but locally contracted interpreter. Little by little, she regained strength. The infection in her foot healed completely. She gained weight. Her voice stopped breaking. Her face recovered expression. She could smile, frown, look tired without looking dead. Still, she didn't know what would come next. Germany lay in ruins. Augsburg had been bombed repeatedly during the final years of the war, and her house no longer existed. She confirmed it through British records and aerial photographs of the city. Her family was dead. Her neighborhood was gone. And although she was technically free to go wherever she wished, she had nowhere to go. She was still a German Jew in a country that had tried to exterminate her. A person without a valid passport, without money, without contacts, without a clear future. Thomas didn't know what to tell her either. His unit would soon be transferred. He had heard it at platoon meetings. The British occupation was being reorganized. The camps were gradually closing, and Dachau would be burned entirely. Barracks, buildings, everything, to erase any remaining trace of typhus. And at some point, probably soon, someone would review the auxiliary personnel lists more carefully. Someone would notice inconsistencies. Someone would discover that Elisa Rosenfeld was not exactly who her papers claimed she was. In June 1945, the situation truly became dangerous. A high-ranking colonel arrived at Dachau to audit the civilian personnel records, amid rumors of corruption, inflated lists, and Germans infiltrating the system by posing as Allied workers. The colonel arrived with a precise order: review every name, every document, every story. Thomas learned about it at a briefing and understood it was only a matter of days, maybe hours, before someone would look closely at Elisa's file. That night, he went to find her. She was alone, sitting outside the barracks, watching a sky that was beginning to darken. He sat down beside her without saying anything. For a long while, they didn't speak. They were just two people on a wooden bench, watching the first stars appear above a field of death that would soon be erased from the map. Finally, Thomas spoke. "They're going to review the paperwork, all of it. If they discover I falsified your record, I'll be arrested, court-martial, military prison, and you'd probably be deported back to Germany, or something worse." Elisa didn't move. She kept looking at the sky. "I'm sorry," he added. "I thought we'd have more time, that things would settle down before they checked." "But it's not your fault," she interrupted, in imperfect but steady English. Thomas turned his head, surprised. Elisa went on, still staring upward. "You gave me time. That's more than anyone has done in 5 years. You gave me the chance to breathe without waiting for death. That has no price." Thomas didn't know what to say. He felt his throat tighten. Elisa continued, "I'll leave before they check. That way you won't get in trouble. You can say I fooled you, that I forged the papers without you knowing." "You can't just leave like that," he said. "Where would you go?" "I don't know," she replied. "But I already learned how to not know once. I can do it again." Thomas wanted to argue. He wanted to say it wasn't necessary, that they'd find another way, but they both knew there wasn't one. The rules were clear. The system was inflexible. And in the aftermath of war, rules were often the only thing still standing while everything else collapsed. That night, Thomas gave her all the money he had, a few pounds, everything he'd saved from his army pay, enough for a few weeks of food, or maybe a train ticket. He also handed her a forged letter of recommendation, handwritten on British letterhead and stamped with a seal stolen from his captain's office. It stated that Elisa Rosenfeld had worked exemplary service as an interpreter for the British Army. Legally, it was worth little, but it was something, a piece of paper with an official stamp. And in the chaos of the post-war world, sometimes that was enough to open doors. Elisa took the money and the letter, slipped them into the pocket of the coat Thomas had also given her, and then did something he didn't expect. She extended her hand, not for an embrace, not for an emotional farewell, but for a firm, formal handshake, as if they were sealing an agreement between equals. Thomas returned the gesture, and in that simple contact, they both understood that this wasn't a dramatic ending or a scene from a film. It was an acknowledgement that they had done what they could. A confirmation that for a moment, two people had decided that rules mattered less than the person standing in front of them. "Take care," Thomas said. "You too," Elisa replied. It was the last time they spoke. The next morning, when Thomas went to find her to warn her that the audit had begun, Elisa was already gone. Her bunk was empty. Her uniform lay folded on the bed. The forged document had disappeared. The Polish women she shared the room with said she had left before dawn, without saying where she was going. Her file was archived as desertion by civilian personnel. The captain asked Thomas if he knew anything. He said no, that Elisa had never mentioned plans to leave. The explanation was accepted without many questions. There were more urgent matters, an entire country to rebuild. One deserter more or less changed nothing in the larger picture. The chaos of the post-war years swallowed the name Elisa Rosenfeld, just as it had swallowed millions of other names, and Thomas Caldwell never heard from her again. For decades, That story remained buried in silence. Thomas returned to Liverpool in October 1946. He went back to the docks and resumed loading ships, just as he had before the war. He married a girl from the neighborhood in 1948, had 3 children, and lived a quiet, ordinary life, without grand gestures. He never spoke about Dachau, not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. When people asked him about the war, he limited himself to saying that he had been in Germany during the occupation, and if they pressed him, he changed the subject. Over time, his wife, Margaret, noticed that there were things Thomas couldn't do. He never watched war movies. Certain sounds unsettled him: the whistle of a train, the sharp clang of a metal door. He also avoided enclosed spaces without windows. She never asked him why. She assumed they were the invisible marks many veterans carried, and that it was better not to touch them. Thomas died in 1987 at the age of 64 from a sudden heart attack while working in the garden. The funeral was small and dignified, with friends from the neighborhood and fellow dock workers. That day, his youngest son, also named Thomas, found a metal box at the back of a closet while helping to sort through the house. Inside were military medals his father had never worn, black and white photographs of Germany he had never shown anyone, and an old, yellowed piece of paper folded into quarters, written in German in a careful, feminine hand. The son didn't know German, but he recognized a few words and a name. "Mr. Caldwell, thank you." It was a letter with no precise date, clearly from the 1940s. It read, "Mr. Caldwell, I don't know if you will ever read this. I don't know if I will survive long enough for it to matter. But I need to write it, even if only for myself. You closed a door, and by doing so you gave me something no one had given me in 5 years. The possibility of choosing what to do next. I don't owe you my life. That phrase sounds too big, too dramatic. I owe you something smaller and more important: the chance to decide what to do with it. For years, others decided for me where to live, where to work, when to eat, when to die. You gave the decision back to me. You gave me a closed door and the possibility of opening it when I chose. I don't know what will happen tomorrow or if I will reach a safe place, but today, for the first time in as long as I can remember, I can choose. And that is a gift beyond words. Thank you." The son kept the letter. He didn't fully understand it, but he preserved it. Years later, in 1995, while researching his father's military history for a school project for his own daughter, he decided to look deeper. He found declassified British records from the camp and came across the name Elisa Rosenfeld on a list of auxiliary personnel, marked in the margins as having deserted in June 1945. He noticed inconsistencies, dates that didn't match, signatures that appeared forged, and understood that his father had risked his career, perhaps his freedom, to protect a woman who, according to official rules, was considered the enemy. He never learned what happened to Elisa after June 1945. There are no clear records. Her name disappears from the archives after that point. Some documents suggest she traveled to Palestine with clandestine refugee groups operating out of the British zone of Germany. Others indicate she spent time in a displaced persons camp in the American zone, near Augsburg. There is even a theory, based on ship manifests, that she changed her name and emigrated to Argentina in 1947. The only thing that can be said with some certainty is that she survived. Because in 1961, during the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, a woman named Miriam Stein testified before the court. She was a survivor of Dachau. She spoke German, Hebrew, and English, with an accent the translators described as British, tinted with German undertones. When she was asked how she had managed to leave Germany after liberation, while so many others remained trapped for years in displaced persons camps, she answered with a strange, almost poetic sentence. A soldier closed a door. The prosecutor looked at her, confused, and asked her to explain. Miriam Stein shook her head. "I can't say it any other way," she repeated. "A soldier closed a door, and that door saved my life." The interrogator assumed she was speaking metaphorically and moved on to the next questions, about Eichmann, the deportations, the camps. Miriam answered everything with clinical precision. Names, dates, numbers. But when her testimony ended and she stood to leave the courtroom, there was something in her posture, in the way she walked and held her head, that conveyed a dignity born not only of survival, but of having chosen how to survive. Years later, in 1987, the same year Thomas Caldwell died in Liverpool, an elderly woman visited the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem and left behind a sealed envelope with instructions that it be opened only after her death. Inside were three things: a letter written in German, a faded photograph of a young woman standing in front of a fabric shop in Augsburg, and a yellowed document on British Army letterhead identifying Elisa Rosenfeld as an auxiliary interpreter. The letter, opened and archived in 2003, told a story. The story of a closed door, of a soldier who decided that the place where someone is born does not define who they are, of a forged document that saved a life. It ended with a simple line: "I never knew his full name. I only know he was from Liverpool. I only know he gave me back the dignity of choosing, and that was enough." The museum attempted to locate Thomas Caldwell's family in order to include him in the Righteous Among the Nations program, Israel's official recognition for non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. But when they reached his son in 2005, too many years had passed. The procedures were complex. Witnesses were gone. Documents were insufficient. And although the story could be broadly verified, it did not meet every bureaucratic requirement. Thomas Caldwell never received official recognition, and he probably would not have wanted it. For him, what he did was not heroic. It was the minimum. It was closing a door. It was not asking questions. It was understanding that sometimes the greatest courage is not a dramatic act, but allowing someone else the chance to decide for themselves. There are no plaques commemorating Elisa Rosenfeld. No streets bear her name. No museum places her story at the center, because it doesn't fit neatly into official narratives. It is not a story of organized resistance, nor of miraculous survival, nor a tale of poetic justice where villains are punished and goodness is rewarded. It is simply the story of a woman born in the wrong place, at the wrong time, who survived because a soldier decided that origin does not define a person. It is the story of an official lie that proved truer than any legal document. It is the story of a closed door that opened a future. There are no monuments to Thomas Caldwell either. No statues in Liverpool. No schools named after him. He never wanted them. To him, what he did was simple common sense, basic humanity. Looking at a person and seeing a person, not an enemy, not a category, not a bureaucratic problem. Dachau was officially liberated on April 15, 1945. More than 60,000 prisoners were found alive. 14,000 more died in the following weeks from disease and extreme malnutrition their bodies could no longer reverse. Thousands of others were repatriated to countries that no longer existed as they remembered them or did not want them back. And among all those numbers, there was one door that closed quietly, and in doing so, changed everything. In August 1945, the camp was burned to the ground to erase any remaining trace of typhus. The barracks, the administrative buildings, everything was reduced to ashes. Today, the site holds a memorial, plaques, museums, and records bearing 60,000 names. But among all those official numbers, among carefully documented statistics, there is one that appears on no list. A woman registered as something she was not, protected by someone who had no official reason to do so, who survived because once, someone decided that the rules mattered less than the person standing in front of him. And the door Thomas Caldwell closed in April 1945 never truly opened again, at least not as it had been before. Because some doors are not closed to imprison. They are closed to protect, to buy time, to say without words that the person on the other side deserves the chance to decide their own fate. And sometimes, in the midst of chaos, war, and systems that reduce people to numbers and categories, that is all it takes. A closed door, a soldier who stays on guard, and the quiet, simple decision to see a person as a person. Nothing more, nothing less. If you know someone from your city or your country whose story deserves to be told, write it in the comments. Perhaps the next invisible hero will be yours.